Jack Holloway ripped the long rifle right out of Emily Carter's hands and lifted it over his head like a trophy so every man on that range could see it. "Honey, this weapon weighs more than your whole arm," he shouted, laughing. "Go find something you can actually carry." The Delta boys behind him howled. Emily didn't grab for her, she didn't raise her voice. She just looked at the far mountains, then back at Jack, and asked 6 quiet words that would end his whole career of underestimating people. "What would you consider a real test?" Before we go one step further, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end of this story, because you are not going to believe what this woman did before the sun went down. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you are watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The laughter didn't die all at once. It rolled through the group of operators like a wave, one man setting off the next, until the whole line of them was grinning and shaking their heads at the small woman standing calm in the middle of it. Jack Holloway held the rifle up a second longer than he needed to, just to let everyone get a good look, then dropped it back into Emily's arms with a shrug that said he'd made his point and the conversation was over. But the conversation wasn't over. Emily caught the weapon clean without a stumble, without so much as shifting her boots in the gravel. She held it the way a person holds something they know better than their own reflection. And that steadiness, that total lack of panic, made a couple of the men stop laughing without quite knowing why. "I'm serious," Jack said, still smiling, playing to the crowd. "No disrespect. There's a reason we build these platforms for guys my size. You need mass behind the stock. You need shoulders. Recoil on a rig like that doesn't care how many hours you spend at the range. Physics is physics." "Physics is physics," Emily repeated, nodding slowly as if she were agreeing with him. "You're right about that." Jack turned to his teammates and spread his hands like a man who just won an argument. "See? She gets it." "I didn't say you were right about me," Emily added. That stopped him. He turned back around. The other operators, 30 or so of them, scattered across the training range in the thin Colorado morning light, started drifting closer. There is a certain sound a group of soldiers makes when they smell a confrontation coming. A low murmur, boots turning in the dirt, conversations dropping to nothing. That sound was building now. Master Sergeant Jack Holloway had been running teams for the better part of 2 decades. He'd kicked in doors on 3 continents. He had a reputation, and reputations in that world are earned in blood and sweat, in the kind of nights nobody ever talks about at home. He wasn't a cruel man, not exactly, but he was a certain kind of man, the kind who had decided a long time ago what a warrior was supposed to look like, and Emily Carter did not look like it. She was small, she was quiet, she kept to herself, and to a man like Jack, quiet and small added up to weak. "All right," Jack said, folding his arms. "Enlighten me, Captain. What am I wrong about?" "You think this rifle is heavy," Emily said. "It isn't. Not if you know where to put it. You think recoil is something you fight. It isn't. Not if you know how to let it move through you instead of against you. You think size is strength." She paused. "It's the thing that gets in the way." A couple of the younger operators laughed, but it was a different kind of laugh. Now nervous, uncertain, the laugh of men who suddenly weren't sure which way this was going to break. Jack's smile got a little tighter. "Big talk." "You started the talking," Emily said. "I'm just finishing it." Lieutenant Noah Bennett, standing off to the side with a spotting scope hanging around his neck, felt his stomach drop. He'd worked with Emily for 3 years. He knew that voice. It wasn't anger. Emily didn't do anger the way other people did. It was something colder and much more dangerous. The sound of a woman who had already decided she was going to make a point and was simply working out the arithmetic of how. "Cap," Noah said quietly, stepping up beside her. "You don't have to do anything here. Let it go." "I'm not doing anything," Emily said without looking at him. "Yet." Jack heard that word, that little "yet," and something in him got competitive. He was a competitive man. It was half of what made him good at his job. "You know what I like you," he said. "I do. You've got sand. But sand doesn't put rounds on target at distance. And that's the whole game out here. So let me make you an offer, one professional to another." He reached into the pocket of his fatigues and pulled out a folded stack of bills, worn soft at the edges, and held it up between 2 fingers. $2,000, right here. Cash. You take that rig, you put a round on the far steel plate, first shot cold bore, and this money's yours. You miss, you buy the whole team dinner, and you never touch a rifle that big again as long as you're on my range. Deal. The far steel plate. Everyone on the range knew the one he meant. It was a man-sized slab of hardened steel sitting almost 1,200 meters out the standard confidence target, the one the new guys used to feel good about themselves. It was a hard shot for an untrained hand and a routine shot for anyone who belonged there. Jack had picked it on purpose. It was just far enough to look impressive to the crowd and just easy enough that in his mind, the only real question was whether Emily's little arms could hold the weapon steady long enough to send the round. $2,000 is not a small amount of money to a soldier. Several of the operators whistled low. A few pulled out their phones. This was going to be a story either way, and everyone wanted to be able to say they were there. Emily looked at the money, then she looked at the steel plate, then she did something nobody expected. She smiled. "No," she said. Jack blinked. "No, that target's too easy," Emily said. "You'd feel bad taking my 2,000 off me on a shot like that, and I'd feel worse taking yours. Let's not embarrass each other." The range went dead quiet. Somewhere a wind flag snapped. Jack's jaw worked for a second, like he was chewing on words that hadn't come out right. "Too easy," he repeated. "For me," Emily said. "Yes." Noah closed his eyes. "Here we go," he thought. "So what do you want?" Jack said. It wasn't really a question anymore. It was a dare thrown back at her, the last card of a man who'd expected to bluff his way to an easy win and suddenly found himself getting called. Emily didn't answer right away. She scanned the range slow and deliberate, the way she scanned everything, taking her time, letting her eyes move past the steel plates and the berms and the vehicle hulks they used for training out toward the far edge of the valley, where the ground rose up into rock and scrub and the mountains began. There was a training vehicle parked out there, a stripped old truck they used as a distant reference point, so far away it was barely more than a smudge against the tan earth. Nearly 2 miles out, maybe farther. She lifted one hand and pointed at it. "See that truck?" she said. Every head on the range turned. "That's not a target," Jack said. "That's a landmark. That's out past the range card. Nobody shoots that far out here." "I know," Emily said. "That's why it's interesting." "Cap." Noah's voice was low and urgent now. "That's 2,700 meters easy. Maybe more. In this wind." 2,720, Emily said without hesitation, like she'd already measured it in her head. "Give or take." A ripple went through the crowd. Some of these men had taken long shots in their careers, the kind that get whispered about, the kind that end up in after-action reports and then in legends. But those were shots taken from prepared positions, with support, with time, with everything lined up. Nobody stood on a training range on a cold morning and casually picked out a target 2 miles away for a bet. Jack laughed, but it came out a beat too late, and everyone heard it. "You can't hit that truck," he said. "Nobody can hit that truck. Not clean, not first round. You'd be lucky to get in the same zip code." "I'm not going to hit the truck," Emily said. Jack threw up his hands. "Then what are we even talking about?" "I'm going to hit something on the truck." She let that sit for a second. "There's a candle." "A what?" "A candle. Or there will be when I'm done setting this up. A little one. On the hood of that truck behind a windscreen, so the wind doesn't kill the flame before I get to it." She turned and looked Jack dead in the eye, and for the first time all morning, there was something like warmth in her face, though it wasn't a kind warmth. It was the warmth of someone who has just found exactly the right way to teach a lesson. "I'm going to put a round through the wick. I'm going to put the flame out and leave the candle standing." For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Then somebody laughed, a short, disbelieving bark, and it broke the spell, and suddenly half the range was talking at once. "That's impossible. She's messing with him. Nobody's threading a wick at 2 miles, come on. Is she serious? She can't be serious." Jack held up his hand for quiet and got it, because whatever else he was still the ranking man on that range. He looked at Emily for a long time, and you could see him trying to work out whether she was bluffing, whether this was some elaborate way of backing out while saving face, whether she'd lost her mind. He couldn't read her. That more than anything is what unsettled him. In 20 years, he'd learned to read men in a glance, to know who would fold and who would fight, and this small, quiet woman gave him nothing. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you're going to shoot the fire off a candle from 2,700 meters and leave the candle. The flame, Emily corrected gently. I'm going to shoot the flame off. The candle stays. The wax stays. Just the wick and just the fire. That's not a shot, Jack said. That's a magic trick. It's not magic, Emily said. It's math and weather and about 10,000 hours of practice that you decided didn't count because I don't have your shoulders. That landed. Jack's face did something complicated. Behind him, one of his own men, a big, quiet sergeant named Ruiz, muttered, "Oh," under his breath, the sound a man makes when he watches someone else take a clean hit. Jack recovered fast. He'd been embarrassed before. He knew the play was to raise the stakes to make the impossibility of the thing so obvious that when she failed, and she was going to fail, everyone would remember the failure and not the moment she'd made him flinch. "Fine," he said. "You want to make it a circus? Let's make it a circus. Same money, $2,000, but now you don't get first-round latitude. You call your shot wick flame candle, standing exactly like you just described it, and if it's not exactly that, you lose. No close, no the wind took it, no excuses. Wick's got to be cut, flame's got to be out, wax has got to be standing. All three, or you pay up and you're done." "I don't want your 2,000, Emily said. Jack's eyebrows went up. "You backing out?" "No." She said it flat and simple. "I don't want your money. If I make the shot, you take that $2,000 and you donated it. There's a family support fund on this post for the wives and kids of the men who don't come home. You put it there, in front of everybody, and you say out loud that you were wrong." The range got very still again. This was different. Money was one thing, a joke between soldiers, easy come and easy go. But this was pride. This was a man being asked in front of his own team to promise to eat his words if he lost. That was a real bet. That had teeth. And everyone watching understood in that moment that Emily Carter hadn't lost her temper at all. She'd walked Jack Holloway step by step exactly where she wanted him, and now he had a choice. He could back down in front of 30 operators, the men who followed him into rooms where people were trying to kill them, or he could take a bet he was now genuinely afraid he might lose. Jack Holloway had never backed down from anything in his life. That was his strength. On that particular morning, it was also going to be the thing that undid him. "Deal," he said. Somebody in the crowd exhaled hard. Ruiz clapped once sharp. Noah put a hand over his own face. "Cap," Noah said, pulling Emily a few steps away, dropping his voice so only she could hear. "What are you doing? What are you doing? That's not a bet you take on a whim. That's a shot you'd need a week to build a real range card, a weather station, a spotter you trust with your life, and even then, one gust, and it's over. And you just told him no excuses. If the wind so much as breathes wrong, you don't just lose the money. You lose everything. Every man on this post is going to know." "I know," Emily said. "Then why?" Emily looked at him, and for just a second the calm cracked, and Noah saw what was underneath it, and it wasn't recklessness. It was something older and heavier, a tiredness he recognized. The tiredness of a person who has spent a whole career being the smallest one in the room and having every single thing they've earned handed back to them with a little laugh and a no offense. "Because if I let this one go, Noah," she said quietly, "then the next kid who walks onto a range looking like me, they let it go too. And the one after that, and it never stops. Somebody has to make it stop being funny." She looked back at Jack, who was already telling his boys how he was going to spend the dinner she was going to buy him. "Today, it stops being funny." Noah stared at her. Then he nodded slow, and something in his posture changed, straightened, because he'd just decided he wasn't watching a friend make a mistake. He was watching a friend go to war, and he was going with her. "Then you're not doing it alone," he said. "You're not building this shot solo. That's insane, and you know it. I spot. My scope, my calls, my numbers. If you're going to do the impossible, you do it with a spotter who's not going to blink." For the first time that morning, Emily's face softened all the way. "I was hoping you'd say that." 27-20, Noah said half to himself, already doing the mental math, already looking sick about it. "In this valley, with this front coming in." He glanced at the sky, where a gray wall was beginning to gather over the mountains, still far off but moving. "You know that weather's turning." "I know," Emily said. "It's going to get worse before you can take it." "I know," Emily said again. "That's the part he doesn't understand yet." What part? She almost smiled. He thinks the weather's going to save him. They set the shot for the following evening. That was Emily's call, and it surprised everyone because conventional wisdom said you shoot long distance in the calm of early morning before the sun heats the ground and stirs the air into rolling waves of mirage and thermals. Evening, especially with a front rolling in, meant unstable air, shifting wind, dropping temperature, all the things that turn a hard shot into a hopeless one. Jack heard the timing and grinned like Christmas had come early. She's setting herself up to fail, he told Ruiz that night, in the chow hall loud enough that half the room could hear. Evening shot weather coming at that distance, she's giving herself an out. When she misses, she's going to say the conditions beat her. That's why she picked the worst possible window. So she can blame the wind. Ruiz, who was a quieter man than his sergeant, didn't answer right away. He'd watched Emily on the range that morning, watched the way she held the rifle, watched her eyes when she pointed at that truck 2 miles out. He'd been doing this a long time himself, and something about the whole thing had gotten under his skin. Or, Ruiz said, finally pushing his tray away. She picked it because she can read weather better than the rest of us can read a range card, and she wants to prove she can do it in conditions none of us would even try. Jack looked at him like he'd grown a second head. You believe she can make that shot? Ruiz was quiet for a second. I believe I don't want to bet against her, he said. That's all I'm saying, Sarge. I don't want to bet against her. Jack laughed it off, but he didn't sleep well that night, and he told himself it was the coffee. Word spread across the post, the way word always does, faster than any official channel, carried in the mess hall, and the motor pool, and the smoke pits. By the next afternoon, it wasn't a private bet between two people anymore. It was the thing everybody was talking about. The captain who was going to shoot a candle at 2 miles. The Delta sergeant who'd bet his own pride against her. People who'd never met Emily Carter had opinions about her. Some of them thought she was a fool. Some of them, mostly the ones who'd been underestimated a time or two themselves, quietly, privately hoped she'd do it. Nobody thought she could. Emily spent that day the way she spent every day before something that mattered. She was calm to the point of being invisible. She ate a normal breakfast. She cleaned her weapon with the unhurried care of a woman polishing a family heirloom. She walked the range not to the firing point, but out along the edge of it, watching the wind flags, watching the way the grass moved, watching the birds, and how they rode the air currents up near the ridge. Noah found her out there in the early afternoon, standing perfectly still, looking at nothing he could see. What are you looking at? He asked. The wind's not one wind, Emily said, not turning around. Everybody talks about it like it's one thing. It's not. It's 4 or 5 different winds stacked on top of each other, all going different directions at different heights. There's the wind here at the firing point. There's the wind in the middle, out past the berms that comes off that low ground and swirls. There's the wind up at the target coming down off the ridge. And when that front hits, all of them are going to change at once. She pointed, tracing something in the air only she could follow. The shot isn't hitting the candle. Any decent shooter can hit a candle-sized thing if the air holds still. The shot is knowing what all 4 winds are doing in the 2.5 seconds the bullet is in the air, and putting the round exactly where all of them added together cancel out to nothing. That's the shot. Noah stared out at the valley, trying to see what she saw, and seeing only tan ground and gray sky and a truck too far away to matter. 2.5 seconds, he said. The round's in the air, 2.5 seconds. About that. Anything can happen in 2.5 seconds. Everything happens in 2.5 seconds, Emily said. That's the whole game. You do all your work before so that when it's happening, you're not thinking at all. You're just letting it happen. The thinking has to be done. If you're thinking when you break the shot, you've already missed. Noah was quiet for a while. Then he said the thing that had been sitting in his chest since yesterday. What if you miss? Emily finally turned and looked at him, and she didn't give him a speech. She didn't tell him she wouldn't miss. She was too honest for that, and Noah loved her for it in the plain, uncomplicated way that soldiers who've bled together love each other. Then I miss, she said, and Jack's right, and every laugh this morning was earned, and I go back to being the small, quiet one who talks too big. And I take the loss, and I don't make one single excuse because I told him no excuses and I meant it. She shrugged. But I'm not planning to miss Noah. There's a difference between a hard shot and a lucky shot. Lucky shots you can't plan. This one I can build. Brick by brick. If I build it right, luck doesn't get a vote. And if the wind does something you didn't plan for, she looked back at the valley, at the gray wall of weather still crawling toward them over the peaks. Then I wait, she said. I wait for the 1 second the wind gives me. It always gives you one. Right before a front hits right when the old wind dies and the new wind hasn't taken over yet, there's a gap, a breath, a second, maybe two, where everything goes still. That's the shot. Everybody else is going to see a storm and think the shot's impossible. And they'll be right 99 seconds out of 100. I only need the one. Noah felt the hair on his arm stand up. How do you know it'll come? Because I've been reading this valley for 2 days, Emily said, and I've watched 3 fronts move through, and every single one of them gave me the gap, right at the leading edge. Every time. She tapped her own temple. The math is done. Now I just have to be patient enough to wait for the door to open and steady enough to walk through it before it closes. That evening they came out to the range in numbers nobody expected. It wasn't the 30 operators from the morning before. It was 5 times that. Word had gone all the way up. There were men and women out there who had no business knowing about a private bet standing in the cold with their collars turned up, because a thing like this doesn't happen twice in a career, and everybody wanted to be able to say they saw it. Somebody had set up lights. Somebody else had a spotting scope trained down range for the crowd. And out at the far edge of the valley on the hood of that stripped old truck, behind a little windscreen of clear plastic, sat a single white candle with a single small flame flickering so far away that from the firing line you could only see it at all through magnified glass, a tiny orange pinprick against the coming dark. Jack Holloway stood near the firing point, with his arms crossed and his $2,000 still in his pocket, and he watched the sky, and for the first time he wasn't grinning. Because the sky had turned mean. The gray wall had reached the ridge. The wind, which had been steady all afternoon, had started to do strange things, gusting and dropping, changing direction, snapping the flags one way and then the other. A few fat drops of cold rain had started to fall. And Jack, who knew enough about shooting to run a range, if not to make a shot like this, understood exactly what that weather meant. It meant the shot was impossible. He should have felt good about that. He told Ruiz she'd fail, and here was the proof rolling in over the mountains doing his work for him. But he didn't feel good. He watched Emily Carter walk up to the firing line, small and calm in the failing light, and lie down behind that rifle that was supposed to be too big for her, and settle in behind it the way water settles into the low ground, finding every point of contact becoming part of it. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt worried. "Captain," he called out, and his voice didn't have the swagger in it anymore. "Weather's turning. Nobody would fault you for calling it. We can push it to tomorrow. Clear morning, calm air. Give yourself a fair shot at it. There's no shame in that." Emily didn't look up from the rifle. Noah was already down beside her spotting scope, up his voice low and steady as he started reading numbers off to her wind temperature, the drop of pressure as the front pushed in, and she was answering him in the same low, even tone. The two of them a closed circuit, a language of their own. "He's giving you an out," Noah murmured between numbers. "Right now in front of everybody. You could take tomorrow." "He's not giving me an out," Emily said quietly, her eye at the scope, her cheek welded to the stock. "He's giving himself one. If I shoot tomorrow and I make it, he gets to say the easy conditions made it possible. If I shoot tonight in this, there's no story he can tell himself afterward. Tonight or never, Noah. This is the only version of this shot that actually proves anything." Noah swallowed. "Wind's all over the place. I've got a full value gust left to right, then nothing, then it swings. I can't give you a stable call. It won't hold still long enough." "I know," Emily said. "So what do you want me to do?" "Read me the gap," Emily said. "When it comes, that's all I need. Don't try to solve the whole storm. Just watch for the moment it dies, when the old wind quits and before the new one starts. You'll feel it before you see it. The flags will go slack. All of them. At the same time. When that happens, you tell me, and you don't hesitate, and you don't second guess, and I'll do the rest." The rain was coming steadier now. It ran down the back of Emily's neck, and she didn't feel it. The cold was in her fingers, and she'd already accounted for it. Out at the far edge of the valley, the little candle flame guttered and shrank and nearly went out, then caught again a tiny stubborn point of orange, refusing to quit, and somehow that felt like the whole thing to the men watching that little flame fighting the storm, waiting for a bullet it would never see coming. Behind them, the crowd had gone silent. 150 people, and you could hear the rain. Jack Holloway stood among them and found that his mouth had gone dry. He'd wanted this to be a lesson. He'd wanted to teach a small, quiet woman that the world was built a certain way, and she didn't fit in it, and he'd expected to enjoy it. But standing there in the cold rain, watching her lie behind that rifle with the total bottomless calm of a person who had done all her worrying weeks ago, he wasn't enjoying anything. He was starting to understand that he might have made a terrible mistake, and not the kind you fix with $2,000. How long can she wait? Ruiz asked him low. I don't know, Jack admitted. The front's almost on top of us. Once it hits full, there's no gap. It's just chaos. She's got her window and it's closing. I know, Jack said, and he was surprised to find that some part of him, some part he didn't fully understand, wanted her to make it, wanted her to walk through the door before it slammed shut. He crushed that thought down and told himself he wanted her to fail, and he almost believed it. Emily lay behind the rifle and breathed, in through the nose slow, out through the mouth slower. She emptied her mind of the crowd, of the money, of the 2 decades of little laughs and no offenses that had brought her to this exact patch of wet gravel. She let all of it go until there was nothing left but the numbers Noah fed her, and the tiny orange flame 2 miles away, and the storm and the gap she knew was coming. The wind screamed across the range, snapping the flags flat. Then it dropped for half a second, and she felt her whole body tense, and Noah said, Not yet, not yet. It's swinging." And it swung and screamed again the other direction. The rain came harder. The flame nearly died. The window was closing. Everyone could feel it closing. 150 people held one breath. And Emily Carter, small and quiet and soaked to the skin, settled her finger against the trigger and waited for the door to open. And then out of the storm, Noah's voice cut through everything, low and hard and absolutely certain. Not yet. Emily didn't move. Her finger rested against the trigger, not pulling, not pressing, just touching, the way you touch something you love and are afraid to break. The rain ran into her eyes and she let it. The cold had crept all the way into her bones, and she'd made peace with it an hour ago. 2 miles away, that little candle flame bent almost flat against the plastic windscreen, and then stood back up, stubborn, refusing to die. And somewhere in the back of Emily's mind, a small voice said, "Hold on, just hold on, we're almost there, both of us." "Talk to me," she breathed. Full value from the left, gusting hard. Noah said, his eye jammed against the scope, his voice steady even though his hands weren't. "Now it's dropping, now it's... No, it's swung. It's coming off the ridge now, quartering. I can't give you a number, Cap, it won't sit still." "I don't want a number," Emily said. "I told you, I want the gap. It's not here yet." Then we wait. Behind them, 150 people stood in the cold rain and did not make a sound. Jack Holloway stood among them with his arms crossed tight over his chest, and he was no longer thinking about the $2,000 in his pocket. He was thinking about how long a person could lie in that position, soaked in freezing muscles, locked without their body starting to betray them. He knew the answer. He'd done it himself on cold mountainsides in places he'd never talk about, and he knew that even the best shooters had a clock running the second they settled in a slow leak of steadiness that no amount of training could stop. Every minute she waited, she got a little colder, a little stiffer, a little less able to make the shot she was waiting for. And the storm was getting worse. "She can't hold that forever," Ruiz murmured beside him. "No," Jack said. "She can't. So either the wind gives her a break in the next couple minutes, or the cold takes the shot away from her before the storm does," Jack finished. He surprised himself with how much he didn't want that. He'd wanted to beat her. He'd wanted to prove a point. But there's a difference between beating someone and watching them get beaten by the weather, by their own body, by the plain, cruel physics of the thing, and Jack found that he had no appetite for the second kind. "Come on," he said so quiet that only Ruiz heard him. "Come on, give her the shot or don't. Just stop hanging her out there." Ruiz glanced at him sideways, surprised, but said nothing. Out on the firing line, Emily's world had shrunk down to almost nothing. There was the storm, and there was Noah's voice, and there was the flame, and there was the rifle that had become part of her body somewhere in the last hour, so that she no longer felt where she ended and the steel began. Everything else was gone. The crowd was gone. Jack was gone. The years of being laughed at were gone. She'd emptied it herself out, poured all of it away until there was nothing left inside her but the patience of a woman waiting for a door she knew was going to open. Winds building, Noah said, and for the first time there was strain in his voice. Cap, it's building, not dropping. The front's almost on us. If the gap's coming, it's coming in the next 60 seconds, and if it doesn't, it's coming, Emily said. How do you know? Because it always comes right before the wall hits. The old wind has to die before the new wind can start. There's always a breath in between. Always. Her voice was flat and calm, a metronome. Watch the flags, Noah. All of them, not just the near one. When they all go slack at the same time, that's it. And if they don't, then I don't shoot and I lose and I take the loss standing up. A tiny pause. But they will. 15 seconds passed. The rain hammered down. The near flag snapped left hard, then whipped right chaos, no pattern. And Emily's finger stayed exactly where it was, touching the trigger. Waiting. 20 seconds. 30. Somewhere in the crowd, a man coughed and got shushed by 3 people at once. 40 seconds. Jack Holloway realized he was holding his breath and made himself let it out slow. And then Emily felt it. She felt it before Noah saw it, the way she'd told him she would. It was a change in the pressure against her cheek, a sudden softening of the air, a stillness that came rolling in ahead of the storm, like the hush before a held note breaks. The scream of the wind dropped off to nothing. The rain seemed to hang in the air. And out across the whole valley, one after another, the wind flags went slack and hung straight down dead from the near line, all the way out to the distant ones near the target, a wave of stillness racing across 2 miles of ground. Gap, Noah said, and his voice cracked on the single word. Gap, gap, all of them. It's here. It's here. But Emily was already gone somewhere he couldn't follow. The word barely reached her. Her body had taken over all the thinking already done, all the math already built. And in the half second the door stood open, she did the only thing left to do, which was nothing at all except let it happen. Her breath was already out, her heart between beats. Her finger, which had been touching the trigger for 4 full minutes, moved the last impossible fraction of an inch. The rifle fired. The shockwave rolled across the range and slammed into the crowd like a physical thing, a crack that echoed off the mountains and came back doubled. And then it was gone, and the bullet was gone, vanished into the storm, invisible on its way across the 2 miles of failing light, on a journey that would take 2.5 seconds, which is nothing and which is everything. Nobody breathed. 2.5 seconds is not a long time. You can barely say a full sentence in 2.5 seconds. But for the 150 people standing on that range, and for Noah with his eye jammed against the scope, and for Jack Holloway with his arms crossed, and his heart doing something strange in his chest, those 2.5 seconds stretched out into something that had no bottom. Emily didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was behind the rifle, her eyes still at the glass because she'd already done everything she could do, and the only thing left was to let the bullet finish its work. And then 2 miles away, the tiny orange flame vanished. It didn't flicker. It didn't gutter and fight and slowly die the way it had a dozen times in the storm. One instant it was there, a small, stubborn point of light against the dark, and the next instant it was simply gone, snapped out, and the darkness closed over the spot where it had been. For 1 full second, the range was completely silent, and then it erupted. It wasn't a cheer, not at first. It was a sound like 150 people, all inhaling at once, a gasp so big it had weight followed by voices climbing over each other. Disbelief and shock and something close to fear, the sound people make when they've just watched something happen that they'd been certain couldn't. Somebody shouted. Somebody else was laughing, high and wild. A young operator near the front just kept saying, "No way, no way, no way," over and over like his brain had gotten stuck. But out on the firing line, Emily Carter didn't move. And Noah didn't cheer because they both knew something the crowd didn't. They didn't know if she'd made the shot. They knew the flame was out, but the flame going out proved nothing. The whole storm had been trying to blow that candle out for an hour. A gust could have done it in the same instant the bullet arrived. The round could have gone wide by a foot, by an inch, by a hair, and the wind could have killed the flame at the exact wrong moment. And from 2 miles away in the dark and the rain, there was no way on earth to tell the difference. The shot Emily had called wasn't putting the flame out. Anybody's bullet in the right zip code or a strong enough gust could put a flame out. The shot she'd called was threading the wick, cutting the wick clean and leaving the wax standing. And whether she'd done that or whether the storm had simply blown out a candle at the same moment her round sail passed it into the dark, was a question that could not be answered from the firing line. Jack Holloway understood this too. It hit him a beat after the crowd started roaring, and it stopped his own reaction cold. He'd been about to feel something, relief or defeat, or he didn't even know what, and then his shooter's brain caught up and reminded him of the terms. Wick cut, flame out, wax standing, all three. Or she lost, and the flame going out told him exactly 1/3 of what they needed to know. He pushed through the crowd toward the firing line, and the noise died down around him as people noticed his face, because his face wasn't the face of a man who just watched someone win a bet. It was the face of a man who just realized nobody had won anything yet. Flames out, he said, looking down at Emily, who was finally sitting up, moving slow, working the stiffness out of fingers that had been locked around a rifle for far too long. Everybody saw it, but that's not the bet, Captain. You know it's not the bet. I know, Emily said. The wind could have taken it. Same second your round went by. There's no way to call this from here. I know, Emily said again. She wasn't arguing. She was rubbing warmth back into her hands, her expression unreadable, giving nothing away, and it drove Jack a little crazy, the same way it had driven him crazy the morning before. He'd just watched this woman do something he would have sworn was impossible, and she looked like a person who'd finished a crossword puzzle. So how do we settle it? Jack said. Emily looked up at him then, and there was the smallest flicker of something in her eyes. Not triumph, not smugness, just a quiet, tired certainty. The same way we always settle it, she said, then we go look. Noah was already on his feet, pulling the spotting scope down, and he looked at Emily with an expression Jack couldn't read, something between awe and terror. Cap, he said quietly, so only she and Jack could hear. The flame went out clean. One frame it was there, next frame it was gone. That's not how wind does it. Wind wrestles it. Wind makes it fight. That was a switch getting flipped. He swallowed. I think you got it. I think you actually got it. But I've been wrong before, and I'd rather see it than say it. Then let's see it, Emily said. Getting out to the target took time, and every second of that drive was its own kind of torture. They loaded into vehicles Emily and Noah and Jack and Ruiz and a handful of others who'd earned their way into the trucks by rank or by luck, and the rest of the crowd stayed behind at the firing line in the rain, and the whole convoy crawled out across the rough ground toward the far edge of the valley where the flame had been. Nobody talked much. The rain drummed on the roofs. Jack sat across from Emily in the back of the lead truck and found that he could not stop looking at her. This small, quiet woman he'd lifted a rifle away from 24 hours ago and told to go find something she could carry, and he felt a slow, sick weight settling into his stomach. The weight of a man who is beginning to understand exactly how wrong he has been. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? He said finally, because the silence was worse. Emily looked out the window into the dark. Same place everybody learns, she said. Time. I just put in more of it than most because I had to. When you look like me, nobody hands you anything. You want a spot on a team, you don't get it because somebody looks at you and thinks there's a shooter. You get it because you're so much better than the guy next to you that they can't find a way to say no. She turned and looked at him, and there was no anger in it, which somehow made it land harder. Every single thing I have, Sergeant, I had to be twice as good to get. So I got twice as good. That's the whole secret. There's no magic. There's just the 10,000 hours nobody watched that don't count for anything until a night like tonight. Jack didn't have an answer for that. He looked away. Ruiz, sitting beside him, spoke up quietly. For what it's worth, Captain. I told him yesterday I didn't want to bet against you. He almost smiled. Best call I made all week. The truck slowed. The candle came into the headlights up on the hood of the old, stripped-down truck they'd used as a target behind its little windscreen of clear plastic. And for a moment, nobody moved because from a distance, it looked completely, perfectly intact. The candle stood there white and whole exactly where it had been placed, and there was no flame. Jack was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped. He crossed to the target with the long strides of a man who needed an answer right now, and the others came behind him, and Emily came last in no hurry at all, walking through the rain with her hands in her pockets, like a woman out for an evening stroll. Jack reached the candle and stopped, and what he saw made his blood run cold, because the candle was standing, and the wax was untouched, not a mark on it, whole and white and perfect. And that was precisely the problem, because if the bullet had done what Emily said it would do, there should have been some sign, some evidence, and there was nothing. The candle looked like a candle that had simply been blown out. It looked like Emily had failed. It looked like the wind had won and Jack had won, and the whole impossible shot had been nothing but a flame guttering out in a storm at the same moment a bullet sailed harmlessly past into the dark. Jack felt a rush of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees, and it was immediately followed by a wave of shame because he realized in that same instant that he wanted the relief more than he wanted the truth, and that was not the kind of man he'd ever believed himself to be. "It's whole," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Captain, the candle's whole. There's no strike. The wax isn't touched. It went out. The wind took it." He turned to face her, and he hated the words even as he said them. Hated the small, mean part of himself that was glad to say them. "I'm sorry, I am. That was the best shooting I've ever seen in my life, and I mean that, but the bet was the wick and the candle standing here whole, and there's no way to prove." "Look at the wick," Emily said. She hadn't raised her voice. She was standing a few feet back, her hands still in her pockets, the rain running off the brim of her cap, and she was looking at Jack with an expression of such total patient calm that it stopped him mid-sentence. "What?" he said. "The wick," Emily said again gently, the way you'd correct a child who'd read the last word of a sentence and missed the whole thing. "You're looking at the wax. Everybody looks at the wax. The bet was never about the wax. Look at the wick." Jack turned back to the candle. He leaned in close enough that the rain fogged on the plastic windscreen, and he looked at the top of the candle where the flame had been, and for a second his brain refused to process what his eyes were telling him. There was no wick. There was no wick. The white wax rose up to a clean flat top, unmarked, perfect, and where the wick should have been, where that little black thread of char should have stood with its flame, there was nothing at all. It was simply gone. Not burned down, not melted over. Gone, cut off flush with the wax as cleanly as if it had never been there. Jack Holloway stared at that vanished wick, and the whole world went quiet around him. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Noah," Emily said without looking away from Jack's face. "Come here, tell me what you see." Noah came up beside Jack and looked, and Jack heard him make a small sound, an involuntary sound, the sound a man makes when something rearranges itself inside him. "The wick's gone," Noah said very quietly. "The wax is whole and the wick is it's gone, it's cut." He straightened up slowly. "You cut the wick cap. You threaded a wick at 2720 meters in a storm in the dark, and you cut it clean off the top of the wax without touching the wax." He turned and stared at her like he'd never seen her before. "You actually did it." Ruiz pushed in to look and swore softly and looked at Jack. But Jack wasn't looking at the candle anymore. He was standing very still, and his face had gone strange because the shooter in him, the part of him that had spent 20 years understanding exactly what a bullet does and doesn't do, was screaming at him that there was a problem with the story. A bullet doesn't stop. A bullet doesn't cut a wick and simply cease to exist. If Emily's round had passed through that wick, it had to have gone somewhere. It had to have kept going. And that meant the evidence, the real evidence, the proof that could not be argued with, wasn't the missing wick at all. It was wherever the bullet ended up. "Where'd the round go?" Jack said slowly, and it wasn't really a question. He already knew. He was just realizing he knew. "It didn't stop. It cut the wick, and it kept going. Where'd it go, Captain?" For the first time since the whole thing had started, Emily smiled a real smile, small and quiet and almost kind. "Now you're thinking like a shooter," she said. "Look behind the candle." Jack turned, and his eyes followed the line, the invisible line. The bullet had traveled from the wick that wasn't there straight back, and behind the truck mounted on a post they'd set up as a backstop was a steel plate. And in the center of that steel plate, dead center, was a single fresh strike. A bright silver crater in the dark metal, still faintly warm to the touch when Ruiz reached out and put his fingers against it, a mark that hadn't been there that afternoon. The bullet had cut the wick, put out the flame, left the wax standing, and continued on for another dozen yards to punch a hole in the exact center of a steel plate. There was no wind that did that. There was no luck that did that. There was no story anybody could tell, no excuse anybody could make, no way to argue it away. The line was drawn in steel from a firing point 2.5 miles back through a wick the width of a piece of string and into the heart of a plate. It was quite simply one of the finest shots any of them had ever seen or would ever see, made by a small, quiet woman that a big, loud man had told one day earlier to go find something she could carry. Jack Holloway stood in the rain and looked at that strike on the steel, and for a long time he didn't say anything at all. The others were quiet too, watching him because they all understood that the shot was over now, and something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with rifles. "I was wrong," Jack said finally. His voice was low. "About all of it." "You were," Emily agreed. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you'd confirm a fact. "I lifted that rifle out of your hands," Jack said, and now the words were coming harder, dragged up from somewhere he didn't visit often. "In front of my whole team. I told you to go find something you could carry. I looked at you and I saw small. I saw quiet. And I decided that meant weak, and I never once thought maybe I was the one who couldn't see straight." He shook his head slowly. 20 years I've been doing this. 20 years and I still looked at you and saw a body instead of a shooter. That's on me. That's nobody's fault but mine." Emily was quiet for a moment. The rain came down between them. "You want to know the part that gets me," she said. "It's not the laughing. I've been laughed at my whole career. I stopped caring about the laughing a long time ago. It's that you're good, Jack. You're actually good. I've heard about you. The men who follow you into rooms would take a bullet for you, and that means something that's not nothing. And a man that other good men trust with their lives, still looked at me and couldn't get past the size of my shoulders." She let that sit. "If you can't see it, what chance does the next one have? That's why I couldn't let it go. Not for the money, not even for pride. For the next kid who's built like me and walks onto a range and hears the same laugh I heard yesterday. Somebody had to make you look. So I made you look." Jack Holloway, Master Sergeant Delta Force veteran of more fights than he could count, looked at the small woman in front of him, and then he did something none of his men had ever seen him do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $2,000, the worn soft stack of bills he'd waved around so confidently the morning before, and he held it out to her, and his hand wasn't quite steady. "I said, if you made the shot, this goes to the family fund," he said, "in front of everybody. And I said I'd say I was wrong out loud." He looked around at the men standing in the rain at Ruiz and Noah, and the others at the faces he'd have to lead again tomorrow. "So here it is in front of everybody. I was wrong about her. I was wrong. This money goes to the fund first thing tomorrow, and I'll stand up in front of the whole company and say why." He pressed the bills into her hand. Emily looked down at the money, and then she did something that surprised everyone, including Jack. She folded his hand back over it and pushed it gently away. "You take it to the fund," she said. "You, not me. Those are your words to eat, Jack, and eating them yourself is the whole point. If I take that money out there, it's a trophy. If you carry it out there in front of your whole company and you stand up and say what you just said to me, then maybe it means something. Maybe the next kid who looks like me gets a little more of a chance because a man like you learned something the hard way." She let go of his hand. "That's worth more to me than $2,000. That's worth more to me than the shot." Jack stared at her. Around them, the rain was easing off the front, rolling through and past, and the first faint stars were beginning to show in the gaps where the storm was breaking up. "You're really something, Captain," he said quietly. "You know that." "I'm really disciplined," Emily said. "That's different. Talent gets you attention." She looked out at the steel plate one more time, at the fresh, bright strike dead center in the dark metal, the exclamation point at the end of a 2.5-mile sentence. "But discipline is what gets you the shot." They stood there a moment longer, the shooters and the spotters and the men who'd come out into the storm to see something impossible gathered around a whole candle with a missing wick and a steel plate with a fresh scar, and every one of them understood in his own way that he'd witnessed something he'd be telling people about for the rest of his life. Not because a bullet hit a target, they'd all seen bullets hit targets, but because they'd watched a person, they'd written off a person they'd laughed at, reach down into 2 decades of quiet, unwatched work, and pull out something so precise, so complete, so absolutely undeniable that it rearranged the way they'd have to think about everything from that night forward. Noah came up beside Emily as they walked back toward the trucks, the two of them a little apart from the others, and he was shaking at his head, and there was a grin on his face he couldn't get rid of. I've known you 3 years, he said. 3 years, and I still didn't fully believe you could do it until I saw that wick was gone. I'm sorry, I should have believed you. You spotted for me, Emily said. You read me the gap when it came and you didn't hesitate and you didn't second guess. That's belief, Noah. Belief isn't a feeling. It's what you do when it counts. And when it counted, you didn't blink. She bumped his shoulder with hers, the closest thing to affection she ever showed. That shot's half yours and you know it. It's not, Noah said, but I'll take the compliment. Behind them, Jack Holloway walked alone for a moment, the $2,000 back in his pocket, his mind somewhere far away. He was thinking about all the ranges he'd run, all the young shooters who'd come through, and he was wondering with a cold and honest discomfort how many of them he'd sized up in a single glance and quietly filed away as not enough. How many candles he'd never seen get lit because he'd blown them out with a laugh before they had a chance to burn. He didn't like the thought, but he made himself sit with it all the way back across the dark valley, because he understood that this was the actual lesson, and the shot had only been the thing that forced him to learn it. Ruiz fell into step beside him. You okay, Sarge? No, Jack said honestly, but I will be. He glanced back over his shoulder to where Emily and Noah were climbing into the lead truck, two small figures in the breaking dark. You know what the worst part is? She wasn't even angry, any of it. She had every right to be furious, and instead she just taught me, like I was one of her guys, like I was worth teaching. He shook his head. I don't know if I'd have been that decent about it, if somebody did to me what I did to her. That's probably why she's the one who made the shot, Ruiz said. Jack thought about that for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly, probably is. By the time the convoy rolled back to the firing line, the crowd was still there, all 150 of them standing in the last of the rain. And when the trucks pulled up, they surged forward with 100 questions, because from 2 miles back and all they'd seen was the flame go out and then nothing. And they didn't know how it had ended. They didn't know if she'd made it. It was Jack who climbed out first, and it was Jack who they turned to because he was the ranking man and because everyone knew whose bet it had been. They wanted him to tell them what happened. They expected some of them that he'd found a way to weasel out of it, or that the candle had proven the wind took the flame, or any of a dozen outcomes that let the natural order of things stay the way it had always been. Jack Holloway climbed up onto the running board of the truck so they could all see him, and he raised his hands for quiet, and he got it. And then in front of 150 people with the rain dripping off his cap and his own $2,000 still in his pocket, he told them the truth. He told them about the wick that was gone, and the wax that was whole, and the fresh strike dead center in the steel plate 2 miles and a dozen yards downrange. He told them it was the finest piece of shooting he had ever seen or ever expected to see. And then he said the part that cost him something, the part his men would remember longer than the shot itself. I told her yesterday to go find something she could carry, Jack said, and his voice carried out over the silent crowd. I lifted that rifle out of her hands, and I told her she wasn't built for it. I was wrong. I was wrong in front of all of you, so I'm going to be wrong in front of all of you now too. That woman is a better shooter than I am. She's a better shooter than anybody I've ever stood next to. And the only thing that ever kept me from seeing it was that I looked at her and made up my mind before she ever touched a trigger. He let that hang there. Don't do what I did, any of you. You look at a shooter, you look at what they can do, not what they look like. That's the whole lesson. Cost me $2,000 and about 20 years of being sure of myself to learn it. He stepped down, and for a second the crowd was quiet. And then somebody started clapping, and then everybody was, and it wasn't for Jack. And Jack knew it wasn't for Jack, and for the first time in his life, he was glad the applause wasn't his. Because it was rolling toward the small, quiet woman climbing down out of the lead truck, the one who'd been laughed at on this exact patch of ground 24 hours before. And she stood there in the rain, in the noise and the light, and she didn't raise her arms in triumph, and she didn't smile, and she didn't say a word. She just looked out past all of them, out to the dark edge of the valley, where a whole candle stood with a missing wick, and where a fresh silver scar sat dead center in a steel plate, and where an hour ago in a storm that should have made it impossible, she had waited for a door to open and walked through it before it closed. The applause was still ringing across the range when Emily turned and walked away from it. Not toward the crowd, not toward the men wanting to shake her hand, but back toward the equipment table where she began quietly and methodically to break down her rifle. Because that was who she was. The shot was over. The lesson was taught. And to Emily Carter, the next most important thing in the world was cleaning her weapon before the rain got into it. Noah found her there a minute later, still grinning like a fool. You know, there's about 150 people over there who want to buy you a drink, he said. And you're out here field stripping a rifle. The rifle doesn't care that I made the shot, Emily said, wiping the bolt down with slow, practiced hands. It'll rust just the same. The people can wait. The steel can't. She glanced up at him. That's the part nobody understands, Noah. The shot everybody's clapping about that took 2.5 seconds. The reason I could make it took 20 years of nights exactly like this one where nobody was watching and there was nothing to win, and I cleaned my weapon anyway. The applause is for the 2.5 seconds, but the 2.5 seconds were the easy part. Noah was quiet a moment. You really don't need any of it, do you? The applause, the credit. I needed him to look, Emily said. That's all I ever needed. The rest is noise. But the rest, as it turned out, was not going to be noise. Because a shot like that doesn't stay on a range, it travels. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, the story of the small, quiet captain who'd threaded a candle wick at 2,700 meters in a storm had already left Fort Carson and started its journey out into the wider world, and it was going to bring things back with it that Emily had never asked for and did not want. The first sign of it came at 06:30 the next morning, when Emily walked into the chow hall and the room went quiet. She'd eaten in that chow hall 100 times and nobody had ever looked up. She liked it that way. She'd built a whole career on being the person nobody looked up for. But this morning when she pushed through the doors with her tray, conversations stopped mid-sentence and heads turned, and a young private near the door had actually stood up, and Emily stopped dead just inside the entrance with the sudden, deeply uncomfortable feeling of a person who has become overnight something other than invisible. At ease, she said to nobody in particular because she didn't know what else to say. Sit down, eat your breakfast. They sat, but they kept looking, and Emily got her food and found the emptiest corner she could and ate fast, and the whole time she could feel it, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, and she hated it, and she couldn't have said exactly why, except that being seen had never once in her life brought her anything but trouble. Jack Holloway found her there at the corner table and set his own tray down across from her without asking. He had, true to his word, already been to the family fund office when it opened. The $2,000 was gone donated, and he'd made the man behind the desk write out a receipt so he could show it around. But that wasn't why he'd come looking for her. Morning, Captain, he said. Sergeant, you sleep. No, Emily admitted. Not much. Jack picked at his eggs. He looked at Emily, thought like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with something and hadn't won. Word's out, he said. Past the post, I mean. Somebody had a phone out last night. There's video. It's already... I don't know how these things work exactly, but it's already gotten off the installation. My phone's been going since 5. Guys I served with 15 years ago calling to ask if it's real. Emily set down her fork. A cold feeling was starting to gather in her stomach. Video of what? Of the shot, of the flame going out, of me standing up on that truck and eating my words. He said it without embarrassment, which was its own kind of growth. And here's the thing, Captain. It's not just the guys, it's up the chain now. I got a call this morning from a bird colonel I've never met wanting to know about the shooter from the video. And when a colonel you've never met is calling about you before breakfast, that means somebody above him is asking too. The cold feeling in Emily's stomach spread. I didn't do it for a video. I know that. I did it for one man and about 30 of his friends on a range in the rain. It was supposed to stay there. I know, Jack said again, but it didn't. And now you've got to decide what you're going to do about that, because I'll tell you right now, Captain, a thing like this doesn't just fade. People up the chain, when they see something like that, they don't think good for her. They think, how do we use this? He leaned forward and his voice dropped. And that's what I came to warn you about, because there's a right way for this to go and a wrong way, and you're about to have a lot of people trying to push you toward the wrong one. Emily looked at him for a long moment. 24 hours ago, this man had lifted a rifle out of her hands and told her to go find something she could carry, and now he was sitting across a chow hall table, warning her quietly and seriously like a man who'd decided her problems were partly his responsibility. It was, she thought, a strange world. What's the wrong way, she said. They make you a poster, Jack said flatly. They take that video and they put you in front of cameras and they turn you into a recruiting tool. Look at what our army can do. Look at the little lady who outshot the big Delta sergeant. They'll love that story. They'll love it to death because it makes everybody look good and it costs them nothing and it puts a nice shine on things. And they'll parade you around until the story's used up, and then they'll set you back down and forget you, and you'll have spent a year of your life being a mascot instead of a shooter. He shook his head. I've seen it happen. Good operators, real ones, turned into billboards because somebody upstairs found them useful. It ruins them, not because they're weak, because you can't do this job and be a symbol at the same time. The job needs all of you. The symbol takes all of you. There's not enough of any person to do both. Emily was quiet for a long time. You came in here to tell me that, she said finally. You, the man who started all of this. Yeah, Jack said, I did, because I started it, and I'll be damned if I'm going to watch it turn into something that hurts you. I was wrong about you once. I'm not going to be wrong about you twice by staying quiet while they turn you into a cartoon. And that more than the $2,000, more than the words he'd eaten, in front of 150 people was the thing that made Emily Carter decide that Master Sergeant Jack Holloway might actually be worth something after all. The call came at 0900. Emily was summoned to the office of the installation commander, a two-star general named Whitaker, and she walked over there with the particular dread of a person who has spent her whole career being invisible and is now being summoned by the most visible man on the post. Noah walked her as far as the building entrance. Whatever they offer you, Noah said, you don't have to say yes on the spot. You know that, right? You're allowed to think about it. I know. I mean it, Cap. You've got a way of deciding things fast and standing by them, and that's usually your superpower, but this one, take your time. I hear you, Emily said, and she went inside. General Whitaker was not alone. There was the bird colonel Jack had mentioned, and there was a woman in civilian clothes with a lanyard that marked her as public affairs. And there was a man Emily didn't recognize at all. Older, sharp-eyed, wearing no rank because he was the kind of man who didn't need to. And they all stood when she came in, which unsettled her more than anything, because generals did not stand for captains. And the fact that they did told her exactly how much the ground had shifted under her feet in 12 hours. Captain Carter, General Whitaker said, sit down. That was quite a demonstration last night. Thank you, sir. It wasn't meant to be a demonstration. No, I imagine it wasn't. Whitaker studied her. But it became one. You understand that video is everywhere now. My phone, the Pentagon's phone, everybody's phone. You've become overnight the most famous soldier on this installation. Possibly the most famous soldier in the Army this week. He let that sit. The question is what we do with that. And there it was, Emily thought. Exactly what Jack said. What we do with that. Not what she wanted to do. What they wanted to do with her. The public affairs woman leaned forward, all warmth and enthusiasm. Captain, I want you to understand what an opportunity this is. Not just for you, for the whole Army. Do you know how many young women see the military and think it's not for them? How many kids who don't fit the mold, who look at a recruiting poster and see a big square-jawed guy and think, that's not me? You could change that. You could be the face that tells every one of those kids that it doesn't matter what you look like. We're talking about a national media tour, interviews, a recruiting campaign built around you. You'd be, no, Emily said. The room went still. I'm sorry, the public affairs woman said. No, Emily said again, calm and quiet, the same voice she'd used on the range. Thank you, but no. General Whitaker's eyebrows went up. The bird colonel shifted in his seat, and the older man in civilian clothes, the one with no rank and sharp eyes, leaned back and smiled very slightly, like a man who'd just seen something he'd been hoping to see. Captain Whitaker said carefully, I don't think you fully understand what's being offered here. This is the kind of opportunity that makes careers. This is a fast track to anything you want. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? I do, sir. And I'm grateful. I mean that. Emily kept her hands folded in her lap, kept her voice even. But I didn't make that shot to become a poster. I made it to prove a point to one man who'd made up his mind about me before I ever touched a trigger. And I proved it. It's done. If you put me in front of cameras and turn me into a story, Then the point I made stops being, look what a disciplined shooter can do, and starts being, look at the cute little lady who fooled everybody. And that's the opposite of what I want. That doesn't help the next kid who looks like me. That turns her into a novelty too. She shook her head. I don't want to be a novelty, sir. I want to be a shooter. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. And if I say yes to this, I lose it. The public affairs woman opened her mouth to argue, but General Whitaker raised a hand and she closed it. Whitaker was looking at Emily with an expression that had changed, that had gone from managing her to actually seeing her. And it was the same shift Emily had watched happen on Jack Holloway's face the night before. And she was starting to understand that maybe her whole life was going to be a series of watching that shift happen on the faces of powerful men one at a time forever. You'd turn down a national platform, Whitaker said slowly, to keep doing your job in the dark where nobody sees you. Yes, sir, because the dark where nobody sees me is where the work happens. The platform is where the work stops. Emily met his eyes. You put me on that platform, and in a year, I'm a worse shooter than I am today, because I'll have spent that year talking about shooting instead of doing it. And a worse shooter is no use to anybody, poster or not. There was a long silence. And then the older man, the one with no rank, spoke for the first time. Captain Carter, he said, and his voice was quiet and dry, and carried the weight of a man used to being listened to. My name doesn't matter, and my unit doesn't have a name you'd recognize, so let's skip that part. I flew here this morning because of that video. I've watched a lot of people shoot in my life. I've watched the best there is. And I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly because a lot rides on your answer. He leaned forward. Last night, the gap in the wind. How did you know it was coming? And just like that, the whole room shifted because everyone in it understood that this was the real conversation and everything before it had been noise. Emily looked at him. I watched the valley for 2 days. I watched 3 fronts move through. Every one of them gave a gap right at the leading edge when the old wind died and before the new wind started. So I knew the 4th one would too. You bet an impossible shot on a pattern you'd observed 3 times. I bet it on a pattern I understood, Emily said. 3 times was enough to understand why it happened. Once I understood why I didn't need a 4th. The physics doesn't change because it's inconvenient. The older man nodded slowly. And the cold. You lay in that position for 4 minutes in freezing rain before you took the shot. Most shooters, their hands are gone in 90 seconds. Their steadiness is shot. How did you hold? I didn't fight the cold, Emily said. You can't win that fight, so I don't have it. I accounted for it. I knew exactly how much my hands would degrade over 4 minutes because I've practiced in the cold 10,000 times, so I built the shot around the hands I'd have at minute 4, not the hands I had at minute 1. By the time I broke the shot, my hands were exactly as bad as I'd planned for them to be. No surprise, no panic, just the plan. The older man was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You built the shot around your own body failing on schedule. Yes, that's not marksmanship, he said. That's something else. Marksmanship is putting the round where you're aiming. What you did is model an entire system, the weather, the weapon, the target, and your own physiology, all degrading and shifting over time, and then find the one instant where all of it lined up to 0. That's not a shooter's mind. That's an engineer's mind wearing a shooter's hands. He looked at General Whitaker. This is exactly what I flew out here to find out. And she's exactly what the video suggested she might be, which frankly I didn't believe until I heard her explain it. Whitaker looked between them. You want her? I want to talk to her, the older man corrected. Privately, about work she'd actually want to do. Not a poster, the opposite of a poster. Work so far in the dark that her own family will never know what she did. He turned back to Emily, and there was something almost gentle in his sharp eyes. You said you want to be a shooter, not a novelty. I'm the one man in this room who can promise you that. Everybody else wants to put you on a stage. I want to put you somewhere nobody will ever look. And I think unless I've badly misread you, that's the only offer in this room you actually want to hear. Emily's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Because he was right. He'd read her exactly. Every other person in this room had looked at her shot and seen a story to tell. This man had looked at it and seen a mind to use, and there is no compliment in the world that lands harder on a person like Emily Carter than being seen correctly for the first time. I'm listening, she said quietly. Not here, the older man said. He stood. General, thank you for the room. Captain, walk with me. They walked out of the headquarters building and across the posts, the older man and the small, quiet captain, and for a while neither of them said anything. It was Emily who broke the silence. You're not going to tell me your name, she said. No. Or your unit. No. How do I know you're real? The older man almost smiled. You don't. That's the first thing you'd have to get comfortable with. In the world I'm talking about, you operate on trust. You can't verify, and you make peace with never getting proof of anything. Some people can't do it. It breaks them. They need the certainty. They need to know the mission mattered, need the medal, need someone to say, good job. He glanced at her. But you already told me you don't need any of that. You told a two-star general to his face that you'd rather do the work in the dark than take a national platform. If that was true, you're one of maybe a handful of people in the entire military who could do what I'm describing. If it was just something you said to sound humble, then you're not, and we'll both find that out fast, and it'll be a short conversation. Emily stopped walking. It wasn't something I said to sound humble. I didn't think it was, the older man said, but I had to hear you say it, standing still with nobody clapping, instead of in a room full of generals. Anybody can be humble when it's impressive to be humble. The question is whether you're still the same person when nobody's watching. And you know what? He looked at her, really looked the way Jack had finally looked at her on the range. I think you are. I think you're the same person on an empty range at 3 a.m. as you are with 150 people cheering. And that's the rarest thing there is, not the shot, the consistency. The shot was just how I found you. Emily didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the 20 years, the 10,000 hours nobody watched, the nights cleaning a weapon on an empty range because the steel would rust, whether or not anybody applauded. And she was realizing with a strange tightening in her throat that this stranger with no name had described her more accurately in 5 minutes than most people who'd known her for years. Why me, she said. There have to be other shooters. There are lots of shooters, the older man said. There are almost no shooters who will turn down a national platform to stay in the dark. I don't need the best hands in the Army, Captain, hands I can find. I need the rarest temperament in the Army, and that I almost never find, and you just showed it to me in front of a 2-star general who was offering you the world. He stopped walking. So let me ask you plainly, and take your time because this is the kind of question you only get asked once. You've spent your whole career being underestimated, and last night you finally got the recognition. The whole Army knows your name this morning, and I'm offering to take all of that away, to put you somewhere so quiet that the recognition you just earned evaporates and never comes back, where you'll do the hardest work of your life and nobody will ever know you did it. He held her gaze. Most people, when they finally get the applause they waited 20 years for, they can't give it up the next morning. It's too cruel. So tell me honestly, Captain Carter, can you walk away from the one thing you spent your whole life earning the very morning after you earned it? And there it was, the real test. Not a candle at 2,700 meters. This, a question with no rifle in it at all. Emily Carter stood very still, the way she stood before every shot that mattered, and she let the question travel all the way in, and she felt the weight of it, because he was right. She had waited 20 years. She had earned it clean in a storm, in front of everyone with no luck and no excuses. And now, less than 12 hours later, a man with no name was asking her to set it down and never pick it up again. She thought about the young private who'd stood up when she walked into the chow hall. She thought about the recognition warm and new in hers. She thought about how good it had felt just for a moment to not be invisible. And then she thought about what she told Noah on the range 2 days ago when he'd asked her why she couldn't just let the whole thing go. The next kid who walks onto a range looking like me, somebody has to make it stop being funny. She'd said that. She'd meant it. And she understood now, standing in front of this stranger, that the recognition had never been the point. It had never once been the point. The point had always been the work, and the work had always been in the dark. And if she said no to this man to keep the applause, then the applause would have made a liar of her. The recognition was never mine to keep, Emily said slowly. It was borrowed. I made a shot and people clapped. And that was nice, but it was for the 2.5 seconds, and the 2.5 seconds were never the real thing. The real thing was always the 20 years nobody watched. She looked up at him and her voice was steady. You're not asking me to give up anything I actually have. You're asking me to keep doing the only thing I've ever really done, which is the work in the dark where it counts whether or not anybody claps. The older man looked at her for a long, long moment, and then for the first time he smiled all the way. Captain Carter, he said quietly, I flew out here this morning half expecting to be disappointed. Half the people in that video would have said yes to the poster before I finished the sentence. I came prepared to shake your hand, tell you it was a hell of a shot, and fly home empty-handed. He extended his hand. I'm very glad to have been wrong. Emily looked at his hand. She didn't take it yet. Before I shake that, she said, I need to know one thing and I need a real answer, not a recruiting answer. The people I work with now, Noah Bennett, my spotter. He read me the gap last night when it counted and he didn't blink. If I go where you're talking about, I go alone, don't I? I don't get to bring the one person who's had my back for 3 years. The older man's smile faded into something more serious, more respectful. That's the first thing you asked about, he said. Not the pay, not the danger, not the glory. Your spotter. He nodded slowly as if she'd passed a test he hadn't told her he was giving. Yes, you'd go alone. That's the cost, and it's a real one, and I won't pretend it isn't. The work I'm describing, you can't bring your people with you. You leave the ones who know you, and you go somewhere where you have to build trust all over again from nothing with strangers in the dark. He held her gaze. I told you it would take things from you. That's the first one. Your spotter. Are you sure you want to keep hearing the rest? And Emily Carter, who 12 hours ago had been the most famous soldier in the Army, and who 12 hours before that had been invisible, and who had spent her whole life learning that the only thing that ever really mattered was the work nobody watched, stood in the cold Colorado morning and understood that she was standing at the edge of a door exactly like the one she'd waited for in the storm. A gap, a moment, a place where everything went still and she had to walk through before it closed. She thought about Noah. She thought about the 20 years. She thought about the next kid who'd walk onto a range looking like her. And then she took a slow breath, the same breath she took before every shot that mattered, and she gave the man her answer. I want to hear the rest, Emily said. But I'm not saying yes today, and here's why. The older man's eyebrows lifted just slightly. It was Emily suspected, not a reaction he got often. I made a promise to somebody yesterday, she said, not out loud, to myself, that I made that shot for the next kid who walks onto a range looking like me. And if I disappear tonight into a place with no name, then that kid never hears the rest of the story. She hears that a woman made an impossible shot and then vanished. That's a legend. Legends don't help anybody. What helps is knowing it was real, knowing it was earned, knowing exactly how it was done so she can do it too. Emily met his eyes. Before I go dark, I need to make sure the lesson doesn't go dark with me. Give me a little time to put the light where it belongs. Then I'm yours. The older man studied her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He laughed quietly and shook his head. You know, he said, I've recruited a lot of people over the years. Every single one of them, when I made the offer, thought about themselves. What they'd gain, what they'd lose, what it meant for their career, their family, their legacy. You're the first one who heard the offer and immediately started thinking about a child you've never met. He nodded slowly. Take your time, Captain. Put the light where it belongs. The kind of work I do doesn't run on a clock, and the right person is worth waiting for. He reached into his jacket and produced a plain card blank, except for a single phone number. When you've done what you need to do, you call that number. Any hour, it'll be answered. He pressed it into her hand. And Captain, for what it's worth, the fact that you're not saying yes today is the exact reason I want you. The ones who say yes right away are running towards something. The ones worth having are the ones who finish what they started first. He turned and walked away, and Emily stood there in the cold with a blank card in her hand, and she understood that her whole life had just quietly split into a before and an after, and almost nobody would ever know it had happened. Noah was waiting for her outside the mess hall when she came back, pretending he hadn't been watching for her doing a bad job of it. Well, he said, what did the general want? To make me a poster, Emily said. Noah's face darkened. And you told him? I told him no. Noah let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. Good. Good, that's Cap. That's exactly right. You're not a... There was another man there, Emily said. No name, no rank. He offered me something else. Something in her voice made Noah stop. He looked at her, really looked the way people who've been through things together learn to look, and whatever he saw made his face change. What kind of something else? He said slowly. The kind I can't talk about. The silence between them stretched out. Noah had been her spotter for 3 years. He knew what that sentence meant. He'd seen operators disappear before good ones, 1 week there, and the next week just gone transferred to a unit nobody could name. And you learn not to ask, and you learn that I can't talk about it was the closest thing to goodbye you were ever going to get. When, Noah said, his voice had gone rough. Not yet. I've got something to do first. Something that matters more than the timing. She looked at him. But yeah, Noah, when it happens fast, and it happens quiet, and I won't get to explain it. So I'm telling you now while I can, so you're not standing on a range 6 months from now wondering where I went. Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something Emily didn't expect. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her not to go. He just nodded slow and stuck out his hand, and when she took it, he held on a beat longer than a handshake needed. You read me had the gap for 3 years, he said. It was the honor of my career, Cap. Whatever this is, wherever you're going, you go to be the best there ever was. And don't you dare look back and wonder if you should have stayed. You were never built to stay anywhere. I knew that the first day I spotted for you. He let go of her hand. Just promise me one thing. Name it. Whatever it is you've got to do first. The thing that matters more than the timing. He almost smiled. Let me help. One last shot for old times. And Emily Carter, who almost never smiled, smiled. Because the thing she had to do, it turned out, needed a spotter. What Emily did next spread through Fort Carson faster than the story of the shot itself. And it caught everyone off guard because it was the last thing anybody expected from a woman who just turned down a national media tour to protect her privacy. She asked General Whitaker for the range. Not for herself, for a class. It happened 3 days later on a clear, cold Saturday morning, and it started small. Emily put out word quietly through the chief instructors that any soldier on the post who'd ever been told they didn't have the build for something, any soldier who'd ever been sized up in a single glance and filed away as not enough was welcome to come to the range at 0800 and learn what she knew. She didn't advertise it as a marksmanship class. She advertised it as something else. She called it in the single flyer she allowed to be posted for anybody who's ever been laughed at on a range. She expected a dozen people, maybe fewer. 200 showed up. They came from all over the post. Young privates and grizzled sergeants, men and women, people built like Jack Holloway, and people built like Emily, and every shape in between. But the ones who came first, the ones who lined up early with something raw and hopeful in their faces, were the small ones, the quiet ones, the ones who'd spent their whole careers like Emily being invisible. Word had reached them somehow that one of their own had done something impossible, and now she was going to tell them how, and they had come from every corner of the installation to hear it. And Jack Holloway came too. He came late, and he stood at the back, and he didn't say anything, and Emily saw him there and understood exactly what it cost a man like him to stand at the back of a class instead of at the front of a formation. She caught his eye across the crowd and gave him the smallest nod, and he returned it, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Emily stood in front of 200 people who'd been told they weren't enough, and she didn't give them a speech about believing in themselves. She was too honest for that, and she knew a speech would evaporate the second they walked off the range. I'm not going to tell you that you can do anything you set your mind to, Emily said. Her voice carried clear across the cold morning. That's not true, and you know it's not true, and I'm not going to insult you with it. Some things really are out of reach. I will never be as strong as Sergeant Holloway back there. That's not a mindset problem. That's physics, and physics doesn't care about my feelings. A ripple of surprised laughter went through the crowd. But here's what they don't tell you. Almost nothing in this world is actually decided by strength. We just tell ourselves it is because strength is easy to see and easy to measure, and the real thing, the thing that actually wins, is almost invisible. She held up her hand. 3 days ago, I put a round through a candle wick at 2,700 meters in a storm in the dark. And I want to be very clear with all of you about how I did it, because there's a lie going around that it was talent, and the lie is dangerous because if it was talent, then none of you can learn it. So let me kill the lie right now. And Sheila looked out over them. It wasn't talent. It was 10,000 hours nobody watched. It was reading a valley for 2 days when everybody else was sleeping. It was practicing in the cold until I knew exactly how my hands would fail, so that when they failed on the night that counted, it wasn't a surprise. It was math I did 100 times until I didn't have to think about it anymore. Every single piece of that shot, everyone, is something any person in this crowd can learn if they're willing to put in the hours nobody claps for. She paused. The strong ones win the fights you can see, but the disciplined ones win the fights nobody's watching. And nearly every fight that actually matters is one nobody's watching. Nobody said a word. 200 people, and you could have heard a pin drop. So I'm not going to teach you to believe in yourselves, Emily said. I'm going to teach you to outwork everybody who ever underestimated you, because that's the only revenge that lasts. You don't beat a man like the one who lifted a rifle out of my hands by getting angry at him. You beat him by getting so good that one day he has to stand at the back of your class and watch you teach. She glanced at Jack, and this time there was warmth in it, and to his enormous credit, Jack Holloway smiled and dipped his head, taking it, owning it, the whole crowd turning to look at him and him not flinching from a single one of their eyes. And then Emily said the thing that Noah would remember for the rest of his life. There's a kid out there somewhere, she said quieter now. Some kid who's built like me. Small, quiet, about to walk onto a range for the first time and hear a laugh. And that laugh is going to try to tell her what she is before she's ever had a chance to find out for herself. I can't stop the laugh, neither can you, but we can make sure that when she hears it, she's got somewhere to go. Somebody who's been where she's standing and can tell her the laugh is wrong and can prove it and can hand her the tools to prove it herself. She looked out over the 200 faces. That's what this is. That's the whole reason I'm standing here instead of on some television set. I turned down the cameras because cameras don't teach anybody anything. But this teaches. So let's get to work. And for the next 6 hours, Emily Carter taught. Not the 2.5 seconds of the shot. The 20 years underneath it. How to read wind that wouldn't hold still. How to build a shot around your own body failing on schedule. How to be patient enough to wait for a gap you couldn't see yet and steady enough to walk through it before it closed. How to do the work in the dark over and over on the days nobody watched, because those were the days that made the difference on the one day that counted. Noah spotted for the demonstrations, and Jack, at some point without being asked, moved from the back of the crowd to the equipment tables and started helping the youngest soldiers get set up behind their rifles, correcting their positions with the same big hands that had lifted a rifle away from Emily a week before. And Emily watched it happen and understood that the lesson had landed in the one place she'd most needed it to land. By the end of the day, something had changed on that range, and everybody felt it, and nobody could quite put it into words. 200 people who'd shown up carrying the private weight of every time they'd been written off walked away a little lighter, carrying something else instead. And it wasn't confidence, exactly because Emily had refused to hand them empty confidence. It was a plan, a path. The knowledge that the thing they'd been told they didn't have wasn't strength at all, and the thing that actually mattered was available to anyone willing to put in the hours. That evening, as the range emptied out and the light went gold and long across the valley, Jack Holloway found Emily at the equipment table cleaning her rifle, the same way Noah had found her the night of the shot. You could have said yes to the cameras, Jack said. You'd have reached 10 million kids instead of 200 soldiers. I'd have reached 10 million kids for about a week, Emily said, not looking up from the bolt. And then the news would have moved on, and none of them would remember my name. These 200, though. She nodded out at the empty range. Every one of them is going to go be a sergeant someday, a team leader, an instructor. And every one of them, when some small, quiet kid walks onto their range and somebody laughs, is going to remember today. That's how you actually reach 10 million kids, Jack. Not from a stage, one range at a time, through people who were in the room. She finally looked up at him. The cameras reach a lot of people shallow. This reaches a few people deep, and the few people carry it the rest of the way. Deep beats wide. It always has. Jack was quiet for a while. Then he said the thing he'd come over to say. I've been doing this 20 years, he said, and in 1 week you taught me more about what this job actually is than I learned in the whole 20. And I don't just mean the shooting. He looked at her. I mean the part where you looked at 200 people who'd been kicked around their whole lives and you didn't sell them a dream. You handed them a shovel and told them to start digging. That's Captain. That's the realest thing I've ever seen anybody do in a uniform. And I've seen a lot. Emily set down the bolt. Can I tell you something, Jack? And it stays between us. Always. I almost said yes to the cameras. She said it quietly, and it was clearly a confession, clearly something that cost her. For about 10 seconds in that office, when the public affairs woman was talking about 10 million kids, I almost said yes. Because part of me, this part, I don't like very much. Part of me wanted it. Wanted to finally be seen after 20 years. Wanted the whole world to know. She shook her head. The pull is real, Jack. Don't let anybody tell you the humble ones don't feel it. We feel it worse because we've gone without it longer. At the last second, I remembered that the version of me who wants to be seen is not the version of me who makes the shots. And I had to pick one. So I picked the shooter. She looked out at the range. But it was close. It's always close. Anybody who tells you it's easy to walk away from the applause is lying to you, or they never really wanted it in the first place. Jack absorbed that. It was, he thought, the most honest thing anybody had ever told him, and it made him respect her more, not less, that the discipline hadn't come free, that she'd wanted the easy thing and chosen the hard thing anyway, which is the only kind of discipline that actually means anything. So what happens now, Jack said. Word is you turned down the general. Word is there was another guy in that room nobody can identify. Word travels, Captain, even for people who don't want it to. Emily didn't answer right away. She thought about the blank card in her pocket with a single phone number on it. She thought about the man with no name and no rank who'd offered to take her somewhere so quiet that the whole world would forget she existed. She thought about Noah and the handshake and the way he'd said you were never built to stay anywhere. What happens now, she said carefully, is I've got a few more things to finish. This class isn't a one-time thing. I'm setting it up to run without me. Training the instructors who will keep teaching it after I'm gone. Making sure that when the small, quiet kid walks onto a range 6 months or 6 years from now, there's somebody there who knows what to tell her, whether or not I'm still around to tell her myself. She looked at Jack. And then when that's built, when it can stand on its own without me holding it up. She paused. Then I've got a phone call to make. Jack understood. He didn't ask. That was the discipline she'd taught him in a week, the discipline not to reach for a thing that wasn't his to know. Whatever it is, Jack said, and wherever it takes you. He put out his hand, the same big hand that had lifted a rifle away from her, the same big hand that had spent the afternoon helping young soldiers into a good prone position. It was the honor of my career to be wrong about you, Captain Carter. I mean that, every word. Emily took his hand, and for the first time since the whole thing had started, the two of them stood there, the big loud sergeant and the small quiet captain, not as adversaries and not as teacher and student, but as something like equals two people who'd both learned the same lesson from opposite ends of it, and there was a peace in it that neither of them had words for. You weren't wrong about me, Jack, Emily said. You were just early. You saw me before I'd shown you anything. That's the mistake everybody makes. It's not that they think small and quiet means weak. It's that they decide before they've seen. You decided in a glance. She let go of his hand. But here's the thing. The night of the shot, when the weather turned, and you told me there was no shame in calling it, you gave me an out. And I've thought about that a lot since, because a cruel man doesn't give you an out. A cruel man wants to watch you fail. You gave me a way to walk away with my dignity in the rain in front of everybody. That's not the act of a man who's decided you're worthless. That's the act of a man who's already starting to wonder if he got it wrong. She almost smiled. You started coming around before the bullet ever left the barrel, Jack. You just didn't know it yet. The shot didn't change your mind. It just gave your mind permission to catch up to where your gut was already going. Jack Holloway stood there and let that land. And it landed deep because it was true. And he'd never quite understood it until she said it, and he realized that this was the last gift she was going to give him. The truth about himself that he couldn't quite see on his own handed, to him plainly and without cruelty, by the one person who had the most right to be cruel to him and had chosen every single step of the way not to be. The sun went down over the valley. The range went dark, and somewhere out past the berms, invisible now in the failing light, An old, stripped truck still sat with a whole white candle on its hood. A candle with no wick. A small monument that nobody had thought to move, standing quiet in the dark as evidence that the impossible had happened here, and would be teachable, and would happen again in other hands on other nights long after the woman who'd first proven it had vanished into a place with no name to go, prove it somewhere the world would never see. The candle stayed on that truck hood for a long time, and it became, without anyone deciding it should, a kind of landmark. New soldiers arriving at Fort Carson would hear the story within their first week, and somebody would drive them out to the far edge of the range and point at the little white candle with no wick, and the story would get told again. And every time it got told, it got a little bigger, the way true stories do when they're carried by people who need them to be true. But that was later. In the days right after the class, Emily Carter did exactly what she told Jack she would do. She built the thing to run without her. It was harder than making the shot. She understood that early. A shot, however impossible, was a single event, a door that opened once and closed once, and all she had to do was be ready to walk through it. But building something that would outlast her, that would keep teaching after she was gone, that was a different kind of work, entirely slow and unglamorous. The kind with no applause at the end of it, which was exactly why she trusted herself to do it right. She picked 6 instructors, not the best shooters on the post, which surprised everyone. She picked the ones who'd been underestimated themselves, the ones who knew in their bones what it felt like to walk onto a range and hear a laugh, because she'd learned long ago that you can teach a person to read wind, but you cannot teach them to care about the small, quiet kid at the back of the line. That part they either had or they didn't, and the 6 she picked had it. "Why me?" one of them asked her, a young sergeant named Alvarez, barely 5'4", who'd spent her whole career being told she'd washed out of things she'd never even been allowed to try. "There are better shooters, there are better teachers. Why pick me to carry this?" "Because you flinched when I said the word laughed in that class," Emily said. "I watched you. 200 people in that crowd, and when I said, for anybody who's ever been laughed at on a range, most of them nodded like it was somebody else's problem. You flinched because it was yours. And that flinch is the whole qualification. You can't teach somebody to defend a kid from a pain you've never felt. You felt it, so you'll defend her without me having to tell you to. That's why you." Alvarez was quiet for a moment. Then her jaw set and something changed in her posture, and Emily recognized it because it was the same thing that had happened to her own posture 20 years ago, when somebody had finally for the first time looked at her and seen a shooter instead of a size. "I won't let you down," Alvarez said. "I know you won't," Emily said. "That's the other reason I picked you. The ones who say, 'I won't let you down' and mean it are rare. Most people say, 'I'll try.' You didn't say try. Hold on to that." The days ran together after that. Emily taught the 6 instructors everything. Not just the shooting, but the philosophy underneath it. The refusal to sell empty confidence. The insistence on handing people tools instead of dreams. She wrote nothing down because the man with no name had made her cautious about what got written down, but she made the 6 of them repeat it back to her until they could teach it in their sleep, until she was sure the lesson lived in them and not just in her, until she was sure it would survive her leaving. Noah watched all of it and said little because he understood what he was watching. He was watching a person put her affairs in order. Not the way a dying person does, but the way a person does who knows they're about to step through a door and never come back and wants to make sure that what they built keeps standing after they're gone. "You're really going," he said one evening, the 2 of them alone at the equipment table, the 6 instructors gone home for the night. It wasn't a question anymore. "I'm really going. When it's built. When it's built." Noah nodded slowly. He picked up a cleaning rod, turned it over in his hands, put it down. "Can I ask you something, Cap, and you can tell me it's none of my business? You've earned better than that from me. Ask. Are you scared?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of question only Noah would ask, straight to the center, no armor around it. "Yes," she said finally. "Not of the work. The work I'm not scared of. I've been getting ready for hard work my whole life without knowing what it was getting ready for." She set down the bolt she'd been cleaning. "I'm scared of the part where I go somewhere, nobody knows me, and I have to earn it all over again from nothing. 20 years, Noah. 20 years to get to where the people around me finally know what I can do. And I'm about to throw all of that away and walk into a room full of strangers who'll take one look at me and think exactly what Jack thought. Her voice was very quiet. I'll have to prove it all again. The whole thing from zero, and I'm tired, Noah. I made the shot. Part of me just wants to rest inside the fact that I made it, and instead I'm choosing to go start over in the dark. She looked at him. So yeah, I'm scared, but scared isn't a reason not to go. Scared is just the tax you pay for doing something that matters. I made peace with that tax a long time ago. Noah looked at her, and there was something shining in his eyes that neither of them acknowledged, because they were soldiers, and there were things soldiers didn't name out loud. For what it's worth, he said, the strangers will figure it out faster than Jack did. Jack took 24 hours and a candle at 2,700 meters. Whoever you're going to, they already saw the video. They already know. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from the best introduction anybody ever had. Emily almost laughed. That's the nicest thing anybody said to me all week. I've got one more. Noah stood up and he looked at her, and this time he didn't hide what was in his face. It was the honor of my life to read you the gap. I'll spot for 100 more shooters before I'm done, and none of them will ever be you. And I'll spend the rest of my career telling the story of the night the wind died, and I called it, and you put a round through a wick 2 miles out in a storm. And every time I tell it, I'll leave out the part where I almost didn't believe you. Because you deserve to be believed, Cap. From the first second, you always did. He put out his hand one more time. Go be the best there ever was, and don't look back. Emily took his hand, and this time neither of them let go for a long while. The last thing she did before she made the phone call was drive out to the far edge of the range alone at dusk, to the old stripped truck with the candle on its hood. She stood in front of it in the fading light, the small, quiet woman in the small white candle with no wick. And for a long time, she didn't do anything at all. She was thinking about the kid, the one she'd never met, the one who was going to walk onto a range somewhere someday small and quiet, and hear a laugh and have to decide in that moment whether the laugh was going to tell her what she was or whether she was going to tell it. And Emily understood standing there that she'd done everything she could for that kid. She'd made the shot. She'd taught the class. She'd built the thing to run without. Her pick the 6 who'd carry it made sure the lesson would survive her leaving. The candle would stand here as proof. Alvarez and the others would keep teaching. And when the kid walked onto that range and heard the laugh, there would be somebody there who knew exactly what to tell her and could prove it and could hand her the tools to prove it herself. It was, Emily thought, the best thing she'd ever built. Better than any shot. A shot ended the moment the bullet stopped. This would keep going long after she was gone in hands she'd never see on nights she'd never know about. And that was the whole point that had always been the whole point in the work in the dark that mattered precisely because nobody was watching it and it kept happening anyway. She reached out and touched the top of the candle, the clean, flat place where the wick used to be, where a bullet had passed through in a storm and put out a flame and left the wax standing. And then she turned and walked back to her truck, and she took the blank card out of her pocket, and she looked at the single phone number printed on it, and the last light went out of the valley, and Emily Carter, who 12 days ago had been invisible, and who for one bright week had been the most famous soldier in the army, made the choice to become invisible, again on purpose, forever. Because the work was in the dark, and so from now on was she. She dialed the number, it rang once, and a voice she recognized, quiet and dry and patient, said, Captain Carter, I was starting to wonder, is it built? Can it stand without you? It's built, Emily said. It can stand. Then it's time. It's time, Emily agreed. There was a pause on the line, and then the man with no name said the last thing anyone at Fort Carson would ever hear about where Emily Carter went. Pack light, he said. Say your goodbyes tonight. And Captain, the people where you're going, they don't know your name, and they never will. You'll walk in as nobody. You'll have to earn it all over again from the ground up with people who will doubt you until you show them. A pause. But I think that's exactly why you said yes, isn't it? Because you already know how to do that. You've been doing it your whole life. Emily looked out at the dark valley, at the invisible truck, at the candle she couldn't see anymore, but knew was standing there in the dark. Yes, she said quietly, that's exactly why. And she hung up the phone and she drove back through the dark toward the barracks to say her goodbyes. And behind her the range lay silent and empty, and the candle stood on the truck hood with no wick and no flame, waiting for the next small quiet person who'd come to learn that the impossible was only impossible until somebody disciplined enough refused to believe it. She said her goodbyes that night, and they were quiet ones because Emily Carter had never been a person for big farewells. She found Noah first in the barracks, and she didn't make a speech. She just handed him her spotting notes, 3 years of them, everything she'd ever learned about reading wind that wouldn't hold still. And she said, "Teach these to somebody worth teaching." And he took them, and that was the whole goodbye. And it was enough because between the two of them, it had always been the things they didn't say that carried the most weight. She found Jack the next morning before dawn at the range because she knew he'd be there. He always was. "You're leaving today," Jack said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He nodded. He didn't ask where. He'd learned that much. But he stood there in the gray pre-dawn light with his hands in his pockets, and Emily could see there was something he wanted to say and couldn't find the shape of, and she waited because she'd learned that Jack Holloway needed room to get to hard things. "I keep thinking about the moment I lifted that rifle out of your hands," he said finally. "I've replayed it about 1,000 times, and every time I want to reach back into it and stop myself, grab my own arm, tell that guy that version of me from 2 weeks ago, you have no idea who you're talking to. Put the rifle down. Watch. Just watch." He shook his head slowly. "But I can't. It's done. I said it in front of my whole team and I can't take it back." "You don't want to take it back," Emily said. Jack looked at her, surprised. "If you take it back," she said, "then none of the rest happens. You don't stand up on that truck and eat your words in front of 150 people. You don't move from the back of my class to the equipment tables to help the young ones into a good prone. You don't learn the thing you learned. The mistake is the reason you grew, Jack. Take back the mistake and you take back the growth. So no, don't reach into that moment and stop yourself. Let it stand. It made you better. Most mistakes don't. This one did. Be grateful for it and move on." Jack absorbed that the way he'd absorbed everything she'd told him over the last 2 weeks, slowly letting it change the shape of something inside him. "You know," he said, "you've got a way of taking the worst thing a person's done and handing it back to them like it was a gift." "That's because it usually is," Emily said. "People just can't see it while they're still ashamed of it. Shame blinds you to the lesson. You have to get past the shame before you can pick up what the mistake left you." She looked at him. "You're past it now. That's why I could tell you. 2 weeks ago you weren't, and it would have just sounded like I was letting you off the hook. Now it sounds like what it is, the truth." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he stuck out his hand one last time. "Go do whatever it is you're going to do," he said. "And Captain, the next small, quiet kid who walks onto my range and somebody laughs," his jaw set, "there won't be a laugh, not on my range, not ever again. That's the one promise I can make you, and I'll keep it till the day I retire." Emily took his hand. "That's the only goodbye gift I wanted," she said. "You just gave it to me." And then she left. Quietly the way she did everything. A single bag, no ceremony. A vehicle came for her at 0700, and she got in it, and it drove her off the installation. And by 0800, Captain Emily Carter was gone from Fort Carson as completely as if she'd never been there at all. And almost nobody saw her go. You know. But here's the thing about a person like Emily Carter. You can take her off an installation. You can send her somewhere with no name. You can make her invisible again on purpose forever. But you cannot unring the bell. You cannot make the 200 people in that class unlearn what they learned. You cannot make Jack Holloway unbecome the man he became. The shot was 2.5 seconds, but the shot was never the point. The point was everything the shot set in motion, and that kept moving long after the woman who'd fired it had disappeared into the dark. 6 months later on that same range, a new soldier arrived at Fort Carson. Small, quiet, a young private named Reyes, barely 19, who joined up against the advice of everybody in her life, all of whom had looked at her and seen a size instead of a soldier. And on her 3rd day, she walked onto the range for the first time carrying a rifle that looked almost too big for her, and somewhere behind her, a big, loud specialist, who didn't know any better, started to laugh. He didn't get the first word out, because Master Sergeant Jack Holloway was on that range, and Jack Holloway crossed the distance between them in about 4 strides, and he got right up in that specialist's face, and the whole range went silent, and what Jack said, he said quietly, but everybody heard it. "You see something funny," Soldier. Sergeant, she's kind of small to be. Let me tell you a story, Jack said. And he told it. He told the specialist, and by extension, the whole range about a small, quiet captain who'd stood on this exact patch of ground and put a round through a candle wick at 2,700 meters in a storm in the dark. First shot cold bore no excuses. He told about the wick that was gone and the wax that was whole and the strike dead center in the steel plate 2 miles and a dozen yards downrange. And then he said the part that mattered. I laughed at her, Jack said. Right here, where you're standing. I lifted a rifle out of her hands and I told her to go find something she could carry. And she made me eat those words in front of 150 people, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it taught me the one lesson this job comes down to. He looked at the specialist and then at young Private Reyes, standing frozen with her too big rifle, her face caught somewhere between humiliation and something that hadn't dared to become hope yet. You never ever decide what a shooter is before you've seen them shoot. You laughed at that private before she put a single round down range. Same as I laughed at a captain who turned out to be the best I ever saw. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize, and then you're going to shut up and watch. Because for all you know, you just laughed at somebody who's going to make you look like a fool 6 months from now. And if she does, a grim smile, it'll be the best thing that ever happened to you. Trust me, I'd know. The specialist apologized, and Private Reyes stood there, and something moved across her face, the exact thing Emily Carter had described to a man with no name in a cold Colorado morning half a year before. The look of a person who has just been told for the first time in her life that the laugh doesn't get to decide what she is. And then a young sergeant named Alvarez, 5'4", who'd been underestimated her whole career and had been picked by Emily Carter for exactly one reason, stepped forward and put a hand on Private Reyes' shoulder and said, "Come with me. There's a class you're going to want to take. It's for anybody who's ever been laughed at on a range. I run it now." She glanced at the too big rifle in the private's hands and she smiled. "First thing I'm going to teach you is that the rifle isn't heavy if you know where to put it. And the recoil isn't something you fight. And your size," Alvarez's smile widened, "your size is going to turn out to be the least important thing about you. Somebody taught me that once. Best lesson I ever got. I've been passing it on ever since." And Private Reyes followed her off the range toward the classroom, and that right there was the whole thing. That was what Emily Carter had built. Not a legend, not a video, a chain. A living chain running person to person, range to range, from a captain who'd vanished into the dark, to a sergeant she'd handpicked, to a 19-year-old private who'd walked in terrified and was about to find out exactly what she was made of. The chain would outlive all of them. It would run for decades. It would reach kids who wouldn't be born for years. And it had started with 2.5 seconds in a candle at 2,700 meters. Nobody at Fort Carson ever found out where Emily Carter went. There were rumors, of course. There always are. Some said she'd gone to a unit that didn't officially exist. Some said she was training foreign shooters in places that weren't on any map. Some said she was dead killed on an operation nobody would ever be able to talk about. The truth was known to exactly one man with no name, and he never told anybody because not telling was the whole job. But every so often over the years that followed, something would happen that made the men and women who'd known her wonder. There was the shot in a mountain range on the other side of the world, an impossible one, a hostage taken clean at a distance, the after-action report listed as not credibly repeatable. Made in conditions that should have made it impossible by a shooter, the report identified only by a call sign nobody recognized. The details leaked the way details do. A storm, a wait, a gap in the wind that the shooter had somehow predicted. A single round cold bore no second chance. Noah Bennett read about it years later in a heavily redacted document that crossed his desk when he'd made lieutenant colonel and was read into things he hadn't been before. He read the description of the shot, the storm, the gap, the patience, the way the shooter had built the whole thing around conditions everyone else had written off as unshootable. And he put the document down and he sat very still for a long moment, and then alone in his office, Lieutenant Colonel Noah Bennett smiled, and he said quietly to nobody at all, "That's my captain. That's my captain reading the gap." He never told anyone, just like she never told anyone, just like the man with no name never told anyone. Because the whole point, the entire point, the thing Emily Carter had understood before anybody else did, was that the work that mattered most was the work nobody watched. And Jack Holloway. Jack Holloway kept his promise. There was never another laugh on his range, not once, not for the rest of his career. He ran that range for another 8 years, and in those 8 years, he became something he had never been before. He met a small, quiet captain who outshot him with a candle. He became the man who protected the ones who got laughed at. Word spread. Small, quiet kids started requesting Fort Carson specifically because word had gotten out that there was a Delta sergeant there who'd break the neck of anybody who laughed at a shooter before they'd shot. It became the thing he was known for more than any door he'd ever kicked in, more than any fight he'd ever won. And when he finally retired and they asked him at his ceremony what he was proudest of in a career that had spanned nearly 30 years, everybody expected him to talk about combat, to talk about the missions, the medals. Instead, Jack Holloway stood up in front of a room full of people and told them about a candle. He told them the whole story. The bet, the $2,000, the rifle he'd lifted out of a small, quiet captain's hands, the storm, the weight, the wick that was gone and the wax that was whole, and the strike dead center in the steel. And then he told them the part that mattered, the part he'd spent the rest of his career living. "I've done a lot of things I'm proud of," Jack said, and his voice was rough with age now, but it still carried. "But the thing I'm proudest of, the thing I want on my headstone, is that one day a woman I'd written off in a single glance taught me that I'd been doing it wrong my whole life, that I'd been looking at bodies instead of shooters, at sizes instead of souls. She could have been cruel about it. God knows she had the right. Instead, she taught me, like I was worth teaching. And then she vanished into the dark to go do the work nobody would ever see because she understood something most of us never figure out." He paused, and the room was dead silent, the way the Colorado Range had been dead silent the night the flame went out. "Talent gets attention," Jack said, "but discipline gets results. She told me that standing in the rain the night she shattered every belief I had about what a warrior could be. And I've spent every day since trying to be worthy of having stood next to her." He looked out at the room. "Wherever she is right now, and I don't know where, and I'm not allowed to know, I hope somebody just underestimated her again. Because I promise you, whoever they are, they're about to learn the same lesson I did, and they're going to be better for it. Same as I was." He sat down, and the room came to its feet, all of them, and the applause rolled over him, and Jack Holloway understood at long last that the applause had never been the thing. The thing was the work. The thing was the chain. The thing was a 19-year-old private 6 years back who hadn't been laughed at because he'd learned not to let it happen. The thing was invisible, and it was the only thing that had ever mattered, and it had taken a candle at 2,700 meters to teach him to see it. And somewhere in a place with no name on a range that wasn't on any map, a small, quiet woman lay behind a rifle in conditions that everybody around her had said were impossible. New people. Strangers who'd taken one look at her and thought exactly what Jack Holloway had thought all those years ago. She'd walked in as nobody. She'd had to earn it all over again from the ground up, from zero, just like the man with no name had promised. And some big, loud operator somewhere in that unit had probably laughed the first time he saw her pick up a rifle too big for her frame. She didn't argue. She'd never argued. She just looked at the impossible target, and she waited patient as the earth for the gap in the wind she knew was coming, because she'd read the pattern and understood the why, and understood that the physics didn't change because it was inconvenient. She emptied herself out, poured all of it away until there was nothing left but the numbers and the target and the storm and the door she knew would open. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat came under her control. And in the one instant when everything went still, when the old wind died and the new wind hadn't started, when the door stood open for a second, maybe two, she walked through it. The rifle fired, and somewhere far downrange the impossible happened again, the way it always did in her hands, and a room full of strangers who'd underestimated her went dead silent the way a Colorado range had gone dead silent years before. And one by one they began to understand exactly who had just walked into their unit. Because that was the truth Emily Carter had known from the very beginning, the truth she'd proven with a candle and taught to a class of 200 and handed to Jack Holloway in the rain and carried with her into the dark forever. The limitation was never her size. The limitation was never the rifle or the distance or the storm or the cold. The limitation was always only the assumption in other people's eyes that skill had anything to do with appearance. And every single time somebody made that assumption, she did the same thing. She stayed quiet. She did the work nobody watched. And then when it counted, she reached down into 10,000 hours of discipline that none of them had bothered to imagine. And she shattered their assumptions so completely that they were never able to make it again. She didn't just hit a candle at 2,700 meters that night in Colorado. She proved once and for all in a way that could never be argued with that a warrior is not built from the outside in. A warrior is built from the discipline nobody sees in the dark on the nights that don't count by the people patient enough to wait for the gap and steady enough to walk through it before it closes. That was the lesson. That was the whole lesson. And Emily Carter spent the rest of her life in places with no names teaching it to anyone foolish enough to laugh before they had seen her shoot. The candle still stands on that truck hood at Fort Carson to this day. It has no wick. It has never been moved. And every small, quiet soldier who arrives at that installation gets driven out to see it and gets told the story and learns before they ever fire a single round that the impossible is only impossible until somebody disciplined enough refuses to believe it. Her name was Captain Emily Carter. They laughed at her once. They never laughed twice.